Hey, hey, sorry, just fooling around with some stuff. Hey, we're at part two of our lecture on the politics of authenticity. Um, let's see, yeah, I'm not going to play music like I did the first time. I did a 15-minute lecture with music and then I uploaded it to YouTube, and YouTube blocked it because of copyright issues, so I'm afraid it's because of the music, so I'm going to try to only play YouTube videos. I assume that they will not be copyrighted, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so uh, we're talking about the civil rights movement now as part of the radical liberal movements of the 1960s and as part of this politics of authenticity, as we talked about. Hey! So from time to time I'll show you my face because I'm sure you miss it. When we talk about the civil rights movement, the classic dating is kind of 1955 to 1965. It's because in 1955 it's the Montgomery bus boycotts with Rosa Parks. This is when Martin Luther King Jr. kind of enters on the scene. But we know from previous lectures, or we should know, is that the civil rights movement had actually been going on well before that. In fact, I follow historians who would say that in many ways the civil rights movement began in 1941 with the Double V campaign. That is really when African Americans began, one, going after Jim Crow, not just trying to make separate but equal work, but they're actually trying to dismantle Jim Crow. It's also during these years that they're pioneering nonviolent forms of direct action. And King himself was a part of the King himself was a part of the Double V campaign. He was raised by this generation of civil rights activists. So understand that the civil rights movement in many ways begins in the North, in cities during World War I, in the Double V campaign. But its classic dating kind of moves to the South in 1955, after the murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycotts in Alabama, led by Rosa Parks. And this is where King emerges as kind of the spokesperson for the movement. And I need to be explicit about calling King spokesperson. Hillary Clinton a few years ago got in trouble for suggesting King was not the leader of the civil rights movement. She was right. King is not the leader of the civil rights movement for the simple fact that the civil rights movement didn't have a leader. It had leaders. It had multiple people engaged in all different kinds of activities. In many ways, like the New Left was not the movement. It was many movements coalescing together. The civil rights movement needs to be understood as the civil rights movements. And for a season, King was allowed to speak, was allowed to be the spokesperson for this coalition of African American civil rights activities in the North, but especially in the South after 1955. For a couple of reasons. King is more so, I think, than anyone else in the movement. He was able to speak an inclusive language that could bring together the white liberals of the North and Midwest, but also bring together African American Christians of the South. King himself had been trained in Northern liberal seminaries, after all, and so he had he could speak the language of African American Christianity, but also the language of American civic nationalism as well too. But it's also because King spoke a message that civil rights activists largely were willing to, themselves were largely preaching too. Now, they didn't use the language of authenticity. You don't see the word authenticity coming up, but you will see in King and in the civil rights movement essentially the logic of authenticity. And we'll talk about that as we go along. King's organization would be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, a group of Christian pastors, largely existing to kind of put the spotlight on King, highlight his message. What was that message? Probably best represented, King never did, he never developed a Port Huron statement, if you will, for the civil rights movement. The closest you get, and you're welcome to read the letter from a Birmingham jail, for a kind of systematic philosophy for King, but just like we kind of had to do with existentialism, or Sartre had to do, we need to do the same with King. So here's kind of King's overall message that we can piece together from his career, particularly between 55 and 65. Hey! Hopefully in the future I can show you pictures of my cats when they come around, or video of my cats when they come around. King was raised in the tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience, or direct action, as it was called in the 1950s. This is something that he learned from other older African-American activists of the 40s, who themselves had learned it from Gandhi, the leader of India's anti-imperial movement against England. And so King, in 1955, with Rosa Parks and other civil rights activists, begins trying to build direct action campaigns, nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns to challenge and ultimately end Jim Crow. And so King's message is one of, well, here's kind of where he starts. Segregation is a sin. The essence of sin is separation. Separation from God, separation from one's fellow man or woman. And what is segregation? Well, it's a visible distillation of human sinfulness. It's literally sanctioning human separation. And thus, laws that support a segregation system are themselves sinful. Not only that, because there is no such thing as a sinful law, essentially laws that mandate segregation they don't exist. They shouldn't exist because they are perpetuating a sinful system. And so King would suggest not only do we have a right, we have a responsibility to resist unjust laws, because after all, there is no such thing as an unjust law. Law is all about justice. Laws which uphold unjust, sinful systems are themselves illegitimate. And so King says it's incumbent upon us to become involved in liberating ourselves and liberating society from this sinful segregation system. King had the model of India to draw upon. As Gandhi built a movement that was not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands, and by the time of World War II, with millions of Indians resisting British colonialism, it became impossible for the British to maintain that system, right? They could put thousands and even tens of thousands of Indians in jail. They could not put millions of Indians in jail. And so, as nonviolent resistance became a truly mass movement in India, the British ultimately were forced to leave that country, and imperialism ended in that country, and India gained their independence. King and civil rights leaders said we need to replicate that here. We need to end the colonialism of Jim Crow. This will only work, however, as African Americans and their white liberal supporters become involved in these direct action campaigns. And it can't just be 100 or 1,000 or even 10,000. It has to be millions of African Americans and their white liberal supporters, like the members of SDS, for instance, becoming involved in resisting the unjust segregation laws of the South, particularly ones that are being wrapped up under massive resistance, as we talked about in the previous version of this class. Here's where the politics of authenticity really comes in. King understood from a practical standpoint that direct action is only going to work as African Americans come out, not by the hundreds of thousands, but by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions. And he understood that in order for this to happen, African Americans needed to overcome the psychological effects of Jim Crow. Just as Tom Hayden and SDS had identified apathy, a psychological malaise affecting the United States, King also recognized the importance of psychological freedom. Now, this is implicit in his writings and messages until 1965-66, the Black Power years. Black Power will, as I'll talk about in a future lecture, Black Power will make explicit things that were implicit in King's message before. This is what King would write eventually in 1967. He would say, psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. This is something that was implicit in King's message between 1955 and 1965. It becomes more explicit later. But here's where it kind of comes in. His message to his supporters is become involved, join in some form of nonviolent civil disobedience, join in some kind of direct action, even if it's registering to vote, or attend a citizenship school meeting, or an SCLC rally, or do something like what Rosa Parks did, or what African American college students are starting to do in 1960, the Freedom Rides. Become involved in some way in direct action. This is only going to work from a practical standpoint. Direct action only works as it becomes a truly mass movement, as it did in India. But King also understood that for those who had been raised in the Jim Crow segregation system, they had grown up believing that they really weren't, and we know this from interviews, they grew up believing that they really weren't as valuable, they really weren't as equal as a person of white skin. And we have testimonies of older African Americans raised during these years, and they talk about this kind of false consciousness, or what W.B. Du Bois called the double consciousness of growing up in a Jim Crow system and being told in all different kinds of overt, but more especially the covert ways, that you are not a true, genuine human being, right? And King understood African Americans needed to overcome the apathy of having internalized Jim Crow. And the best way to do that was to become involved in direct action campaigns. As African Americans mobilized to liberate others from the actual and the psychological effects of growing up Jim Crow, they themselves would be transformed and liberated. Again, this is a message that becomes more explicit in the later King. It's the Black Power advocates who really bring that out in him, but it's there implicitly in his messages, a message of authenticity, a message of becoming involved in nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns with the goal of helping others achieve a sense of authenticity, self-worth, self-direction. Eventually we would call this Black Power. Whether your movement worked out or not, you yourself would be transformed. Whether your particular direct action campaign saw success or not, and a lot of the activities of the civil rights movement were not successful. Nevertheless, you yourself as an individual would be transformed. You would have thrown off the shackles of growing up Jim Crow, and you would achieve a kind of psychological freedom. So even though King did not, explicitly speak the language of existentialism and nonconformity and authenticity, I should say that King was very familiar with Paul Tillich. He actually did his dissertation on Paul Tillich, so he himself was steeped in a kind of Christian existentialism. That the wording of authenticity doesn't come up that much in the civil rights movement. It does in Black Power. It doesn't come up that much in the civil rights movement. But nevertheless, we can read between the lines and see that in many ways the New Left and its Port Huron statement and the message of King was a very similar message. Become involved in movements for others' liberations, and as you do, you yourself will be liberated. You will achieve authenticity through helping others achieve authenticity, in this case through combating racism, and particularly the legal racism of the Jim Crow system. This is a message that King is allowed to speak, deliver for an extended time, but it is important to understand that it's for as much as people accepted King as the spokesperson of the movement, that they'd have some differences with him. Hey, I'm still here. one of those persons who was fairly outspoken in their differences with King was Ella Baker. Baker had entered into the civil rights movement or civil rights activities all the way back in the 1920s when she became a community organizer in Harlem. If you've heard this term community organizer before, how did Barack Obama get his start in public life after law school? He was a community organizer in Chicago. This is what Baker's doing in Harlem right after the Great Migration. She's there in Harlem engaging in community organization. Eventually, Baker will be asked to come on staff at the NAACP. She'll be a field secretary, meaning she goes out into African American communities, writes reports on the problems African Americans are facing, the possibilities for some kind of legal or community action or other that could go on there. And she's working in the field. Baker ultimately leaves the NAACP in 1944, which is significant. As I've talked about in previous lectures, the NAACP is achieving its greatest numbers and potential in World War II as a part of the Double V campaign. Why does Baker leave the NAACP when it just seems to be catching fire? And it has everything to do with Baker's differences with the NAACP. From her standpoint, all the NAACP is concerned about is more kind of high-profile legal cases, and here she is, she's doing all this field work, she's writing all these reports, and they just seem to get filed away back in the NAACP headquarters, and nothing really seems to be done. And Baker says, why am I, spending my time, spending my time trying to develop or cultivate civil rights activity here at the grassroots if the leadership of the NAACP is not going to support it. Baker had a philosophy. The philosophy was strong people don't need strong leaders. Strong people don't need strong leaders. That's her philosophy, and that's what she had been trying to build as an NAACP field secretary. She gets frustrated, leaves that organization, goes off back into more grassroots educational activities among African American communities. When SCLC forms in 1955, they asked Baker to come on staff. She reluctantly accepts. She understands that she has some differences with King, but nevertheless she comes into the organization. She ultimately leaves it in 1960. And just really, for people who knew Baker, she really shouldn't have surprised anyone. After all, her philosophy was one of grassroots education and grassroots organization, cultivation of local leadership. Whereas it seemed that SCLC was more of a top-down kind of movement. It was more about putting the focus on King and trying to portray King in some ways as the leader of the movement. And a lot of African American activists, including Baker, they as much as they liked King's message, they had a hard time accepting his top-down philosophy of leadership. In fact, some civil rights activists even wrote letters to King saying, hey, love your message. Couldn't you be doing more to help African American, cultivate African American leadership at the grassroots levels? And from kind of personal testimonies we have, King usually kind of laughed off those pleas. And so Baker leaves in 1960, and she's clearly upset with King. She'll give an interview at one point, and she doesn't explicitly mention King, but you tell me who else could she have been talking about. This is what Baker says. She says, I've always felt it was a handicap for oppressed people to depend so largely on a leader, because unfortunately in our culture, the charismatic leader usually becomes a leader because he has found a spot in the public limelight. It usually means the media made him, and the media may undo him. There's also the danger in our culture that because a person is called upon to give public statements and is acclaimed by the establishment, such a person gets to the point of believing he is the movement. Such people get so involved with playing the game of being important that they exhaust themselves and their time. They don't do the work of actually organizing people. That's pretty clear. I mean, Baker's trying to be smart here. She doesn't want to burn her bridges with King or SCLC. They want to keep the civil rights movement together because, after all, they have a common enemy in Jim Crow. But there are significant fissures, differences of opinion among civil rights activists, and a lot of it had to do with the question of leadership. For Baker, it was really an issue of how do we organize people so that they can begin to lead themselves rather than depend upon a charismatic figure like a Martin Luther King Jr. Baker leaves in 1960s because she saw an opportunity for grassroots organizing. It's in these years that it's in 1960 that African Americans, without any kind of top-down, well, I mean, they are being influenced by King, but just kind of on their own, African Americans in several cities at black universities begin going into the towns where the universities are housed and start engaging in nonviolent protests. Like, they weren't allowed to eat at a Woolworths, so they go eat at a Woolworths. This is happening in several southern cities. As African American, mainly college students, are just kind of spreading the word. Hey, this is something we did here. You guys should try that in your city. And they try it in their city, and they say, hey, you guys down the road, you guys should try this too. And so these kind of sit-in protests just kind of spontaneously are arising in 1960. Baker and SCLC see this going on. Baker quits SCLC. With SCLC's blessing, she goes to these campuses. She gets these college students who are engaging in these sit-in actions. And in late 1960, they call together a conference to form a new organization. This is happening with SCLC's blessing. So, again, despite their differences, they found ways of sticking together. Baker will head a new organization known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Or as we'll be calling it from here on out, SNCC. See, it is indebted to the philosophy of King and nonviolent civil disobedience, direct action campaigns, but notice the coordinating word there too. SNCC can be understood as the guerrilla warriors of the civil rights movement. They're the ones who are on the front lines. They're the ones who are in African American communities, going to get African Americans to register to vote, to attend a citizenship school to teach them about their basic citizenship rights under the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. They are the ones holding SNCC rallies, which were kind of like church services. They were building the grassroots support and finding the leadership in African American communities that already were there, trying to do the work of coordinating direct action campaigns. And so they are the bottom-up side, the guerrilla warriors of the civil rights movement, whereas King and SCLC are really the top-down movement. So there's some significant differences of opinion there, and it's there from fairly early on. Nevertheless, the movement holds together. In fact, it even coordinates together pretty nicely. The leadership of SNCC and SCLC work together to see how their different philosophies of leadership could actually be cooperative rather than competitive. This is how the partnership between SCLC and SNCC would work. They would identify a particular city, a city facing a lot of segregation, and they would target that city for direct action. SNCC would go in several months in advance and begin doing the coordinating work. They would work with African American communities. They would also bring down new lefters like Tom Hayden from the University of Michigan, bring them in to engage in coordinating work too, and they would kind of lay the groundwork for direct action. And then at a particular point, King would come in, and when King comes in, he brings the media of the country and the world with him, and they would engage in direct action campaigns, hoping, as I've talked about in the previous lecture, hoping to capture. Now, they are not going to engage in violent resistance. They're nonviolent, but they are, as we've talked about, courting massive resistance violence, right? They want to get massive resistance violence on film. They want to see segregationists acting violently and capture that on film. That is what had produced action on the part of the federal government in 1957, and is what they're hoping will provide civil rights success going forward. So in Selma, Alabama in 1962, SNCC goes in, does his coordinating work. King comes in, brings the media with him, and nothing happens. The Selma's leadership does not bite. There's no violence caught on film. Birmingham, May of 1963, SNCC had come in several months before, done its coordinating work. King comes in that month. They're going to engage in nonviolent direct action. For instance, hey, you guys can't march down the street. Okay, we're going to march down the street. They would engage in these nonviolent direct action campaigns, and in Birmingham, just like in Selma, the leadership did not bite. Birmingham looked like it was going to be another failure like Selma. Leadership was ready to pack it in, kind of a last-ditch, desperate act. They're meeting together, say, hey, let's have another march. Let's hold another march. This time, let's put the kids up front. And, we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll get Birmingham to crack at this particular moment. And so another march is held, the so-called Children's March. And these are the images coming out of Birmingham on the day of the Children's March. The segregationist, racist, white supremacist leadership, massive resisting leadership of Alabama, they bite. They turn dogs and fire hoses on civil rights marchers, in this case on children. The country is, the country knows the name of Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of the country by the late 50s, 1960s, they support more rights for African Americans. I mean, generally the tide had kind of started to turn there. At the same time, the civil rights movement itself and King himself were very unpopular. Many Americans considered King to be a communist. The U.S. government considered King to be a communist. They considered civil rights activists to be communists. They really wondered, we get that African Americans should have more rights, but why are you guys forcing the issue? Why are you pushing the issue? It didn't make sense to a lot of Americans. And then they turn on their news the night of the Children's March, and they see fire hoses being turned on children, and they're like, what the heck is going on in Birmingham? They had no idea that these were the conditions that African Americans were under. And there is massive outcry after the Children's March for the federal government to have to do something. John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert understand these guys, they wanted to fight the Cold War. They wanted to beat the commies. They were not interested in taking up civil rights. They weren't opposed to more civil rights for African Americans, but they didn't want to take up that issue. They understood that a lot of the Democratic base at that time still was in the segregationist South, and they didn't want to challenge their Democratic supporters in the South, and they really considered King and the civil rights movement a nuisance. But after the Children's March, it became quite clear to Kennedy that he had to do something. He goes on TV that night, delivers a speech in which he says race has no place in American life or law, and pledges his administration to a kind of second Reconstruction, if you will, to making good on the promises of the first Reconstruction after the Civil War. He promises robust civil rights legislation to end segregation, to end racial violence in the South. But for Birmingham goes the slogan. If it had not been for Birmingham, the civil rights movement might have been a total and abject failure. Nevertheless, on the momentum gained by Birmingham, and Kennedy pledging his support for new civil rights legislation, yes, Kennedy would be assassinated, but in some ways that made it even easier for his successor, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, who was a firmer supporter of African American civil rights. It made it easier for him to help pass in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, by far the most significant piece of civil rights legislation in American history to that time and really after that. All the basis of civil rights legislation for African Americans, but for women, for the LGBTQ community, dates back for disabled Americans, all dates back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then based on another round of nonviolent direct action in Selma in 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so this kind of, again, remember the Cold War context of all this. America is concerned about its international reputation. The Kennedys and then Johnson, in this context, will lend their support. Congress will lend its support towards significant advances in dismantling Jim Crow and promoting a more level playing field for African Americans moving forward from 1965. What you see pictured there is the March on Washington. The March on Washington was in some ways the high point of unity in the civil rights movement. For all of their differences and fissures, SNCC, SCLC, the top-down, the bottom-up leadership of the movement could come together in 1963 in the March on Washington. This is where King would give that speech, I Have a Dream. It is important to understand that we in many ways misremember this march. After all, it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We just call it the March on Washington now. When we put the Jobs and Freedom in the title, it reminds us that for all of the social gains of the 1960s for African Americans, the economic gains were few and far between. We're still in many ways trying to work out the second Reconstruction. Many people are wondering, are we going to need a third Reconstruction? In the same way that after the first Reconstruction, there was a movement of a counter-revolution that was known as redemption. In many ways, that happens in the 1960s. The second Reconstruction saw a second movement of redemption known as white flight, which we'll talk about in future lectures. And so some are wondering, do we need a third Reconstruction in your lifetime? We'll see if that's coming about. But in 1963, this is in many ways the highlight of unity for this movement, and they can kind of enjoy their most significant successes after Birmingham, and then Selma kind of coming right after it. It's after 1963 you see the civil rights movement and the tensions that had always been there. You see that beginning to split. Hey, my wonderful face, I'm still here. Let's talk about briefly these splits. We'll talk about them more substantially in the future when we talk about Black Power. But let's talk about one person who in many ways helped encapsulate these new or growing divisions within the civil rights movement, and that would be Fannie Lou Hamer. Hamer had grown up in the South. She was the wife of a sharecropper. Hamer would wife multiple children. It's in the early 1960s that a SNCC member comes knocking on her door and says, "Hey, Fannie Lou, you ready to come to town? We're going to get people together to go register to vote." Hamer says, "What? I'm an African American. I don't have a constitutional right to vote. Do I?" "Yes, you do." And Hamer, her kind of first act of defiance of segregation would be her going with SNCC members to register to vote. Her and her family would be, she would come back to find that her and her family had been evicted. This was part of massive resistance, the nonviolent side of massive resistance. African Americans who even do things like register to vote got kicked out of their homes. Nevertheless, Fannie Lou Hamer persisted. She would become a leading member of SNCC. Hamer became famous in the movement for her singing. I won't play this because I might get in trouble with YouTube if I do, but I'll send you a video. I'll send you a video of Hamer singing to you and kind of get a sense of her voice. It's pretty incredible. It's in 1963, shortly after Birmingham, that. No, I'm sorry. It's before that time. Hamer is returning. She had been at one of these SNCC rallies. She's returning with a group of activists like herself, grassroots activists, on a bus. The police pull her over. A number of people on the bus were arrested, including Fannie Lou Hamer. They were taken to jail. In jail, the police officers force African American janitors there to sexually assault and beat Fannie Lou Hamer and her fellow activists. Hamer herself is the victim of physical assault and probably, from her testimony, probably certainly sexual humiliation as well too. But she is beaten badly. This is the logic of massive resistance at work, right? If we just act violently enough, we will force African Americans and their white liberal supporters to back down, to go away, to give up their agitation, as is often known. Those agitators like Fannie Lou Hamer, those commies like Fannie Lou Hamer. Well, that didn't work in Hamer's case. She became more emboldened for the movement. She would eventually, these officers would be put on trial for what they had done, and Hamer would stand up and give personal testimony. And in the middle of the courtroom, she would look at those guards and she would say to them, "What are you guys going to do when you have to stand before God and give an account of what you've done?" She's just emboldened. Go bolder. I like to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer as kind of the Che Guevara of the civil rights movement. Somebody who for much of her life lived a powerless, I wouldn't say apathetic, but just a powerless life. That's how you grew up under Jim Crow. And through the work of groups like SNCC, Hamer is transformed into this revolutionary individual. But her revolution, her authenticity, if you will be expressed in ways that show the heightening fissures of the civil rights movement. This really comes about in 1964. 1964, Freedom Summer is introduced. The SNCC members, with a lot of support from New Lefters, from the North and the Midwest, are engaging in a massive voter registration campaign. The goal is, the Democratic National Convention is going to be held in 1964. It's a presidential election year. They want to get huge numbers of African Americans registered to vote so that SNCC can send its members to the DNC in 1964 and really get the DNC to commit to furthering the Second Reconstruction. Right, building on the success of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, really get the Democratic Party to be the party of civil rights going forward. And so, Freedom Summer, the number of people who, the kind of therapeutic radicalism went into the Freedom Summer. I know some of you might be familiar with Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Zinn is a long face of kind of the academic revolutionary. Zinn was one of these individuals who participated in Freedom Summer and marked that as kind of his transforming moment when he shifted from becoming kind of the apathetic, other-directed college student into a committed revolutionary through his participation in Freedom Summer. On the success of Freedom Summer, the SNCC forms the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, and they go to the DNC that summer. with the goal of getting Johnson, the Democratic Party, to really commit to advancing civil rights. And they are profoundly disappointed. They go there with the goal of being seated, having a place at the table with all the other state delegations, both from Mississippi and from around the country. And what they find is that Johnson and the rest of the Democratic Party will not seat them, will not give Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, will not give them representation at the DNC. Hamer will, and I'm sorry I can't play this clip there too, Hamer would give a television interview in which she recounts her story of what happened. And she says, and if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. And you think about the contrast with this language with King's, right? I have a dream, it is an American dream, King had said in 1963. Here's Fannie Lou Hamer on television in 1964 saying, I question America, highlighting that African Americans were growing frustrated, not just with the nation's lack of movement on civil rights, but with the Democratic Party's movement on civil rights. Johnson freaks out when she does this television interview. He tries to get all the networks to not run it. They do end up airing it after all. So Fannie Lou Hamer does, the sharecropper's wife, this transformed revolutionary, does go on national television and says, I question America. It's a pretty amazing moment. Johnson, in a compromise, will try to give the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party 2 seats, some voice at the convention, but by that point, the members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were done with it. Now, 1968, the DNC will be much better at giving African Americans representation in the group, but by that point it was much too late. The Black Power movement was in full steam by 1968. And as I'll talk about in future lectures, ultimately the Black Power movement comes out of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's experience at the DNC. Ultimately, the Black Power comes out of SNCC. And it comes out of the frustration of the feeling that these white liberals like Johnson are not willing to move quickly enough, or more correctly, not willing to respect the voice, the autonomy, the authenticity, if you will, of African Americans. As people like Fannie Lou Hamer are looking to express themselves, as they are looking to overcome the psychological effects of Jim Crow and all find their authentic selves, right? This is what nonconformity meant for African Americans. It meant ending the Jim Crow system, ending this system that denied them a sense of authenticity or self-direction. As they, this was kind of the final straw, as I'll talk about. They had always had this tension with the King and the broader movement through these years, but the final straw really kind of came in 1964 with the frustrations of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And as African Americans and SNCC, particularly Fannie Lou Hamer, looked to express themselves, to achieve a sense of authenticity. In this particular case, their search or quest for authenticity meant the fracturing of the civil rights movement into a civil rights movement and ultimately the Black Power movement. We'll talk more about that in the future, but just kind of in closing, to kind of bring things back together, is understand how these movements that, yes, had some cross-fertilization. As I said, a lot of New Left college students were coming down from the North, in the Midwest, and working in the civil rights movement. and learning from the civil rights activists there. The civil rights movement was benefited from its associations with white liberals. Nevertheless, these are very different people from very different circumstances, right? The differences between a Tom Hayden, a University of Michigan philosophy student, and a Fannie Lou Hamer, these are very different people, but understand something that bound them together was this politics of authenticity. A commitment to finding a way in life which was authentic, to overcoming the conformity of the 1950s and 1960s, but doing so, finding a sense of authenticity through becoming involved in a movement to help others achieve authenticity too. This is something that marks the individualism of the 1960s as unique to that era. It's not something that will really persist into our time. I don't think that the you do you mentality today is necessarily one that is joined to a sense of helping others do themselves, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I think that's all I got to say. Peace out.